When it was, I'm going to read from verse 1 then, verse 27. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Andrea, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded, and found it 20 fathoms. When they had gone a little further, they sounded again, and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern, and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat out of the sea under the colour as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, "This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you." And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were in all in the ship 260 souls. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where 2 seas meet, they ran the ship aground. And the forepart struck fast, and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Hi Molly, hi Roger, nice to see you tonight. All right, in this chapter we continue with this particular shipwreck saga that the Apostle Paul is going through. We read of some 276 men that are enduring quite a harrowing time at sea. We see that there was a period of a storm, a period of time of about 2 weeks in the midst of this particular storm, and it was followed by a shipwreck that could easily have killed them all. But even though there was this shipwreck that they were going through, there was a preacher on board of this boat that had predicted that none of them would be lost. They would be shipwrecked, sure, but they would be saved. Now, the things that we read of in Acts chapter 27 here, we have an account, and as we saw last night, all of the Word of God is absolutely true, is absolutely free from any kind of error, but we have an account that is historically true. And we also have an account that we can look at the geography, and we can look at the chronological or the timeline of these various events, and also look at the nautical account of all that's been taken on. By nautical, I don't mean people that are naughty, Roger, but I'm talking about from a ship's perspective. But even all of these accounts have been taken and independently verified that these things took place as they did. So in other words, they measured the distances, the time, the place where Paul's ship had run aground, and so on. So what we read here in Acts chapter 27 is not just an interesting story, because it really is quite an interesting story when you think about how he's just going from one crisis to the next. Throughout all of this, he's just on the edge. At any moment he could lose his life. It's not just interesting, but it is quite inspiring as well. And for you and I as Christians, it's wonderful to see as to how God was able to undertake and help and save not just the Apostle Paul, but also everyone that was on the boat as well. And what's inspiring about it is that as we go through the journey of life, there'll be times when you're going to be in some serious weather. You'll be going through times of a storm. And you might even fear that you might even be shipwrecked. You could lose everything that you have. You could go through a time where you just couldn't imagine how awful a time you could have. But when you think about it, even if your shipwrecks are going to be a physical thing, or whether it's emotional, or whether it's spiritual, there is always help to be had in our God. And the important thing that we want to emphasize tonight is that our faith needs to be anchored upon Him, so that we will be able to withstand in the time of storm. And the other thing that is quite interesting in this particular story here is that there were 276 souls upon the boat. Not one of them could just leave the boat by themselves, as we see that some of the sailors try to do that. They had to stay together. They were in it together. If they were to be saved, they were to be saved together. And this reminds us that we're in this together. As a church, we don't face this journey alone. We face it side by side. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. And if you're going through a difficult time and you're hurting, then we as a church hurt. If you're rejoicing, we as a church rejoice. We are in this thing together. So let's just look at some of the things of this particular story that we read. The first thing that's quite interesting is that we begin by reading that it was 2 weeks that they had been battling in the storm, and they were absolutely helpless and defenseless, but 2 weeks, and they hadn't even taken the time to eat. You can just imagine that they were physically and emotionally just absolutely spent. And on the 14th night of this particular storm, the crew sensed that they were nearing a piece of land. And so they lowered down a weight and they sounded. Now, of course, today you would use various types of equipment with sonar to tell you how deep you have, how much draft you have below the boat. But in those days, of course, they didn't have that. So what they would do is they would lower down ropes, and they would have knots in the ropes. They would count the knots as they lowered the ropes down with the weight, and they would be able to determine how deep or how shallow the water was in. And we read of fathoms, and a fathom basically is about 6 feet. So they let down the ropes, and the first time they measured, they got to about 120 feet. That's how deep they were in. And then they measured a little bit later, and they found that they were in about 90 feet of water. So they could tell they were getting more and more shallow, and of course they needed to do something about it. So when a person's in a boat and in the storm, because we tend to be a bunch of land lubbers, we think to ourselves the danger is being in the water in the boat. If we can get to the land, then we'll be safe. But the fact of the matter is the closer you get to land, the more dangerous things are. While you're in the boat, you might be bobbing around in the sea, but you don't have the danger of being smashed to pieces on the rocks. So most of the time people think if we can get to the land, then we'll be safe. I don't know if I told you the story, but we used to enjoy sailing in South Africa, and we went sailing and we were caught in the storm. And we weren't very good salesmen. And it was myself and my father and my nephew, Warren. He was about 9 or 10 years old. And he was petrified the whole of the time. And we were just saying, oh, Warren, it's just an adventure. You're going to enjoy this trip out with us. But he was literally petrified. And he was holding on to the mast. He really was petrified. And of course, it was quite a serious storm. And truth be told, I was somewhat petrified myself. So anyway, we were going back to the place where we moored the boat up, and there was our anchorage was, you'd have like a buoy. If you get hold of the buoy, you put onto the front of the boat, and then the boat comes to a standstill. The boat weighs, quite a number of tons, so you've got to have quickly get it onto the front of the boat to bring the boat to a standstill and secure. But of course, you're coming into the land, and it's always a dangerous thing. So I was steering and my dad was in the front. And so we were doing what we could to slow this boat down. And we were going too fast. And we caught hold of the buoy with the rope, which would anchor us. And my dad tried to get it onto I can't remember what the thing is called, but the thing in the front would to hold it, but it was at the force of it was too much, and he had to let it go. So there we are, we're going through all these boats around us and getting closer and closer to the land, and there's just nothing that we could do. I learned a great deal of lessons, of following that, but the story ended with us literally being shipwrecked. We landed up, the boat, we couldn't do anything else, but the boat went into the sand, onto the shore. And God really had protected us, because there were rocks all around us, but where we landed was just sand, so the boat didn't have any damage. So you can imagine the scene. The boat is on its side, lying, like about a meter deep in the water. Warren had been petrified all of this time. He was beaming because he was standing in the water, chest high in the water, and he could feel sand under his toes, and he was happy. I'm on the ground, I'm happy. And that's how a lot of people think. If we get to the land, that's where we're going to be safe. But the fact of the matter is, it is fraught with a whole lot of danger. And it was quite funny, because the boat was like full of water. And he said to me, he said, he's in the water, it's gone dark, He says, Uncle Simon, can you see my mint imperials anyway? And things are just floating around, so it's just quite funny. But the danger is that when you go to the land, that you could be dashed in pieces. And the sailors, when they were lowering the ropes down, they recognized that they were becoming, in more and more in a situation where it was dangerous. So what they did is they threw out 4 anchors to the stern, to the rear of the boat. And now you think about this is not normally the place where you would throw out an anchor. Normally you'd throw an anchor out in the bow, and that's where you'd anchor it. You never do it from the rear. But the reason why they did it to the rear is because the only way that they were going to be saved on this harrowing journey was to really run this boat aground. This boat was damaged beyond repair. They weren't able to control it properly. And the only way that they could save themselves was actually to run the boat aground. But now this is night time, and they didn't know where they were going. So they cast the 4 anchors out, and they were able to have the boat pointing in the right direction. So when daybreak came, they could lift up the anchors, weigh the anchors, and they were able to steer the boat, hopefully, to a place where it would be safe for them to run aground. This was their thinking. So verse 29 says that, fearing that we should be fallen upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. Don't you sometimes feel like that when you're going through a terrible storm, and all you can do is just throw out a few anchors and wish for the day, hope for the morning, quite literally praying for the new day? And this is what their situation was like. Sometimes life can be like that. But we also read on in the story, it just goes from one crisis to the next, as to how there were some of the sailors on board that actually tried to get off the boat and use the lifeboat so that they could sail away to safety. And you think to yourself, well, whatever happened to the matter of the captain going down with the boat? He's the last to leave the boat, type of thing. These sailors are going to get off the boat and leave everyone else to fend for themselves. You think about crises that you go through, even as a Christian. A crisis can bring out the very best of men, but sometimes a crisis can bring out the very worst of men. And I think with the Apostle Paul, it brought out the very best of men. But with these particular sailors who were trying to escape for their lives, it brought out, just the self-preservation that they had. But Paul had to stop it. And so they were trying to make as if, we're going to get into the boat, lower it into the water, and we're going to put some more anchors out in the front of the boat. But Paul was quite astute, and he knew that that would be a pointless exercise, and he could recognize that they were really just trying to escape for their lives. And so everyone else might have been fooled, but Paul was not. And so in verse 31, the Bible says that Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall. Now this is an interesting phrase, because Paul said, if they don't stay here, then we're not going to be saved. Now God had stood with Paul, and God had encouraged Paul by saying that they would be saved. Paul had in fact told this to everybody, the ship's going to be lost, but we're going to be saved. But here he's saying, if they don't stay in the boat, we can't be saved. And the reason for this is because God was going to answer this particular predicament they were in by using those sailors. If those sailors got off the boat, how could they navigate? Who would be equipped to navigate the boat into a place where they could safely, in terrible conditions, but at least safely run aground? So God wanted those people, these people needed to be on the boat so that God could deliver them safely. And sometimes we think as Christians, well, I've got a particular problem, and so I'm going to take it to the Lord, and I'm going to leave it there. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that. We've got to take our burdens to the Lord and leave them there. But there is this aspect of where we've got to do our things as well. And the things that we can do, we should do. We shouldn't expect God to just somehow intervene and do for us what we should really be doing for ourselves. And so Paul said, these people need to stay in the boat, because if they don't stay in the boat, then we're not going to be saved. They had a part to play to bring them safely to the shore. So the boat fell to the waters, the sailors went about their duties, and the soldiers watched them with a careful eye. And then Paul does quite an unusual thing, but quite a practical thing. Paul insists that they take the time to eat. Now he knew that these men were struggling with fatigue, and he knew that they were hungry, and he knew that they needed to be strengthened for the new day. And so he encourages them. In verse 34, he says, "Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you." Paul is saying, look, you guys haven't eaten. We've got a big day ahead of us tomorrow. You need to take the time to eat. So he says, let's have a fellowship meal. See, that proves that he was a Baptist. Because if we have a problem, let's get together and we'll have a meal, and we'll solve the problem. This is what Paul did. Let's get together and we have a meal. So Paul, he knew that they're not going to die from the danger of the sea, but he didn't want them to die from starvation either. So he insists that they take a meal. And so on a very practical level, he says, you need this nourishment. This is absolutely important. You've perhaps heard it said of people sometimes that person is so spiritually minded or so heavenly minded that they know earthly good. Have you ever heard that saying? They're so heavenly minded, they know earthly good. Now that might be true of some people, but really, if you're heavenly minded, you're going to be of some real good, earthly good, So the Apostle Paul was someone that was a spiritual man. He was indeed heavenly minded, but he was practical, and he knew that they needed to take the time to eat. And so very practically, he insists upon them eating a meal. And I love the scene in verse 35, because it says, "And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat." Now the language of verse 35 is almost as if he's about to have a communion with them, the way that he talks of him breaking bread and so on. But it wasn't a communion meal, but it was a meal that was quite symbolic. Because before he ate, and of course this is a good practice for all of us to do, before we eat any meal, we should thank God for what He's provided for us, and we should be willing to do that in the midst of an ungodly environment as well. Paul didn't say, well, there's 276 souls here, and there's only 2 or 3 Christians, so let's get to corner. We'll huddle together and we'll have a word of prayer, thanking God for the food. In the presence of them all, he stood up and said, let's give thanks. And that's a good testimony. If you go out to eat in a meal in a restaurant, give thanks. Thank God for the meal that you're about to have. And it's a blessing to everyone that's in your group, and it's a testimony to those that are without. Because whoever sees people publicly thank God for a meal they're about to have, it's a great testimony. So they had this meal after giving of thanks. But you know what was so wonderful about this simple matter of thanking God for the food is that it brought these hardened soldiers and these hardened sailors into the very presence of God. They'd gone through a harrowing time, but here they've been brought into the presence of God, bowing their heads and thanking God for what they're about to eat. Let me tell you something, that was something that had an impact in the hearts and lives of these people. In fact, the simple meal actually transformed things, because in verse 36 it says that they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. That's a wonderful thing, isn't it? You know, when you get together with people and you pray before a meal and you have a meal, you can be really encouraged by it. Verse 30 says they were all in the ship, 216 souls, 276 people eating a meal together on a ship that had very nearly become their coffin, eating a meal together, thanking God for what he had done. And then as we read on in these verses, we see the survival of the shipwrecked. The remainder of these verses tell us as to how they began to lighten the boat even more. And the reason why they lightened the boat, in other words, they got rid of all the tackle that they didn't need to have. They'd already thrown some stuff overboard, but they got rid of even more stuff, and they got rid of all of their provisions. The reason why they were doing this is they were making the boat lighter, so the boat would rise in the water, and so they'd be able to get closer to the shore. So it was quite a practical thing that they did. And then when day began to break, they saw an opening where they would be able to sail the ship onto a beach, and then they would, remember they got the foresails in the back, and they lifted up the four anchors in the back rather, they lifted up the anchors, and they lifted up the two
masts.
No, here's someone used to sail and I forgot what they're called, but the not the oars. Rudder, thank you. So there would have been two rudders at the back that they would have lifted up out the water. They would have tied them up so that they wouldn't have been broken in the storm. Now they lowered them into the waters again. They saw an opening where they were able to go in, and they set sail for that particular area. So they would have put up a storm sail, just some of the mainsail, and would have just geared to go down into that particular area. And as they went to this particular reef or a shoal, the Bible says that the front end of the ship struck into the ground, so they ran aground, and the stern, the rear part of the ship began to break apart under the force of the waves. And so it's just one crisis after another. And so they had to jump in the waters or get hold of a piece of broken wood and allow them to be taken to the shore. But we read in verse 42 that the soldiers actually wanted to kill the prisoners, because the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners lest any of them should swim out and escape. And verse 43 says, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And the rest, some on boards, and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. It was quite a miraculous thing that the soldiers didn't kill the prisoners, because in those days, the Roman soldier, it wouldn't be today where if you're a policeman and you had someone under your care, that you better make sure that you give a living person back to go to jail or to go into prison. As a Roman soldier, it didn't matter if the guy was dead or alive, just as long as you give somebody back. Otherwise, you're going to take his place. So the Roman soldiers thought to themselves, let's kill these people so they can't escape. They were thinking for themselves. But the centurion looked upon the Apostle Paul and wanted to save him, and indeed stop them from their purpose. But I would just like to draw your attention back to verse 29, because it's an interesting story about a shipwreck. But we have a tremendous lesson that we can learn from verse 29. The Bible says, then fearing, lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. Now there's going to be times when you and I as Christians are going to be going through such a terrible storm that we don't know what we're going to do. And if we don't do something, that we are in danger of being cast upon the rocks as well. What shall we do? And the Bible's instruction to us is, in times like that, you've got to throw out some anchors that are going to be firm and that are going to be steadfast and that are going to hold you while the winds are blowing and the waves are going over your heads, but it's going to hold you fast.
To show you love to God.
So what we need to do now is think as to what could these anchors be. Now I was thinking about this. What could we say some of these anchors be? So we could say, well, maybe one anchor could be faith, or to be steadfast, or to be prayerful,
Life.
or to remain faithful,
Strength.
or strength. So we could have a number of things that we could say, well, these will be my anchors. I'll be strong, I'll be steadfast, I'll pray, I'll have faith. These will be my anchors. But the fact of the matter is, those anchors are going to come loose. Those are anchors that you might be throwing out, but you might just be trusting in something that is going to shortly come apart. So we need to have something more than just faith and prayer and steadfastness or strength. Our anchor needs to be actually in our God himself. And so when you think about this, he is the anchor to the soul, isn't he? And so, but it speaks about 4 anchors that they cast out. So I think when we think about these 4 anchors that we cast out, I think we could think in terms of, in 4 different ways in which it can be a great anchor to our soul when we think as to the storms that we're going through. The first anchor we could throw out, we could say would be the anchor of the presence of God. You know, God had appeared to Paul and God had encouraged Paul by his very presence. Paul, I'm going to be with you. Paul, you're going to be saved. The ship is going to be destroyed, but in fact, everybody on it is going to be saved. And Paul was greatly encouraged by that, by the very presence of God. So that the wind was howling, the storm was out of control, but God was with them. The presence of God was with them. And when you're going through a time of storm, and it seems like you don't know which way to turn or what to do, understand this, that Jesus said, I will never leave you and I'll never forsake you. And that's a wonderful promise. Lo, I am with you always. And so we can trust in this particular anchor that the presence of God is going to be with us wherever we go. And of course, we can see this time and again in the Word of God. You think of young Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. The presence of God went down with Joseph. And how did Joseph come out so victorious out of the land of Egypt? Or you think about Daniel being cast into the den of lions. The presence of God was there, shutting the mouths of those lions. Or the 3 Hebrew children cast into that fiery furnace. There was one walking about in the midst of them, even the Son of God, that kept them safe from the flame. So we need to understand tonight that the first anchor is the fact that we have the presence of our God with us. That is something that is going to really be a real anchor to our souls. Paul said in verse 23 of this chapter, he said, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. And when you think about the presence of God, you know this is something that you can never escape. You can never get away from the presence of God. He is, of course, everywhere all of the time, but as believers, he is present in our lives. And so we can be greatly encouraged by this fact. We have the presence of God with us. And then the second thing is, we don't just have the presence of God, but we have the promises of God. So in verse 24 and 25, Paul said this, or God said this to Paul, I beg your pardon, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. So what Paul is saying is, I'm just going to trust in the promise of God. God has promised that I'm going to be taken to Rome and I'm going to be able to give an account for myself there in Rome. I'm just going to take God at his word. And one of the things we learned last night at the discipleship was that God has magnified his word above his name. So let's understand this, that when God says something, he's always going to perform it. We have the promises of God. The promises of God are true, and so we can lay a hold upon them. Like Abraham of the Old Testament, the Bible says that he said in Romans chapter 4, verse 21, that being fully persuaded that what he had promised, what God had promised, he was able also to perform. So the second anchor that we can throw out in that time of the storm is not just the presence of God, but the promises of God. And then the third anchor that we can lay out for us is that anchor of understanding the purposes of God. Because when you think about this, God said to Paul, he said, you must be brought before Caesar. You've got a job to do, Paul. I've still got a purpose for you to perform. So if you think about this, as believers, God has a job for us to do. And the third thing that we can throw out as an anchor as we think about our God is to understand his purposes. The storm that we go through, we remember that verse, all things work together for the good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purposes. Nothing happens to you by chance. There's no such thing as good luck or bad luck. These are part of the purposes of God. And you can just trust in the fact that God has a plan and a purpose for your life. And so you can just put that out as an anchor. And then lastly, the fourth anchor can be the performance of God. By performance, I mean his track record. God has always been faithful. God has never let you down. In fact, the very fact that you're here with us here tonight, and you've all been through various storms, you've all been at times where it seems like you've almost been on the rocks, but God has come through. God has been faithful. And God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And when you think about his past performances, you're able to say, well, God has provided and kept me safe yesterday, and I know that he's going to do the same for me today and tomorrow as well. So we're going to trust in the performance of God, because God is a God who is going to be undertaking for us today, just like he did for us yesterday. The fact is that when we're going through a storm, we often have a very bad memory. We think, what are we going to do? How shall we do? Who's going to help us? And we forget as to how God helped us in times gone by. And so that would be the fourth anchor, is to recognize the purposes of God. These are anchors that I think that can really help us. If our anchor is going to be, well, I'm just going to hold on, I'm going to pray more, I'm going to be more faithful, I'm going to be stronger or more steadfast, well, sooner or later, the load is going to be too much for us to bear. But if we say the thing that I'm going to hold on to is my God, he's the anchor of my soul. He's the one that's able to keep me. And I'm going to hold on to him and understand his plan and his purposes and his promises and realize his presence. I'm going to hold on to that. And I'm going to just wish for the day. Like they did. They cast out the four anchors and wish for the day. And that's what we need to do. Just hold on to our God. And he'll hold on to us and look for the new day. So may the Lord encourage us tonight. God is in control of absolutely everything. Remember when Jesus walked upon the water, the disciples thought that they were going to perish. The waves were over their head. Lord, we're going to perish. But the waves were over their head, but they were under his feet. They were under his control. And Jesus comes to us in the midst of our storm. And likewise, those waves are under his feet. They're under his control. And we need to just hold on to him and look to him to help us through that storm. So may the Lord help you and encourage you with these verses tonight. Amen.